Warm good morning to you all, dear listeners of Stories with Jane. How many of you have ever stood on a quiet country platform and felt that strange little prickle when something arrives far sooner than it should? I should love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If these gentle mysteries bring you comfort of an evening, do consider subscribing. It helps our little corner of storytelling continue. And now, settle in, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let us step back into a world of steam, lace curtains, and secrets that travel by rail. Chapter 1. The Early Arrival. Miss Jane Marple had always believed that trains, like people, were most interesting when they behaved out of character. On a soft October morning in 1932, the 9:17 from Paddington arrived at the tiny halt of St Mary Mead at precisely 8:17, 1 full hour early. The station master, Mr Hodge, stood on the platform with his mouth open and his pocket watch dangling uselessly from its chain. The guard stepped down, looking equally bewildered, and muttered something about signal failures up the line that convinced no one. Miss Marple, who had come to meet her goddaughter's trunk, watched from beneath the brim of her sensible hat. She had arrived early herself, habit really, and so she saw everything: the solitary first-class carriage that stopped opposite the waiting room, the single passenger who descended without haste, and the way the man's gloved hand never once left the leather case he carried. He was tall, silver-haired, and dressed with the quiet perfection of a man who had never known a tailor's bill to be questioned. His face was pale, almost translucent in the thin morning light, and when he paused to look about him, his eyes moved with the careful calculation of someone counting exits. Miss Marple noticed something else. The man did not ask directions. He did not glance at the timetable board. He simply walked, with measured steps, toward the lane that led to the vicarage, and beyond it to the old manor house that had stood empty these past 3 years. "Extraordinary," said Colonel Bantry, who had driven down to collect a parcel of books. "Never known the 9:17 to be early in my life, usually late enough to ruin luncheon." Miss Marple smiled her vague, gentle smile. "Trains are like village gossip, Colonel. They arrive when they mean to, not when the timetable says they should." She said nothing more, but later that morning, while arranging Michaelmas daisies in the drawing-room of her little cottage, she found herself thinking of the silver-haired man's leather case. It had been the sort of case a solicitor might carry, or a man who preferred not to trust banks. By noon, the entire village knew of the early train. Mrs Price Ridley declared it an omen. Miss Hartnell muttered about German agents, though the war had been over 14 years. Only the vicar's wife, Griselda Clement, offered a practical theory. Perhaps the engine driver simply wanted an early cup of tea. Miss Marple listened to them all at the Women's Institute meeting and said very little. She did, however, ask one quiet question of young Gladys, who worked in the post office. "Has anyone collected the letters for the Grange this week, Gladys?" Gladys shook her head. "No, Miss Marple. Box is still full." Mr Fortescue's solicitor said the place was to stay closed till the estate was settled. That was last March. The Grange, empty. And yet a man with a leather case had walked straight toward it as though he knew the way by heart. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on her old friend Dolly Bantry. They sat in the sunny corner of the Bantry's garden, where the last roses still clung stubbornly to their stems. "Jane," said Dolly, "you have that look, the one that means you've noticed something the rest of us have walked past." Miss Marple poured tea with careful hands. "Only that the 9:17 has never, in living memory, arrived early, and that the gentleman who stepped from it did not look like a man who had been inconvenienced by the change in schedule. He looked expected." Dolly's eyes widened. "You think someone was waiting for him?" "I think," Miss Marple replied softly, "that someone may have arranged for the train to be early. Signal failures are convenient things, are they not? Especially when one wishes to arrive before the village is properly awake." They fell silent for a moment. Somewhere in the distance a woodpecker tapped at an oak, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary village afternoon. Yet Miss Marple's mind was already travelling backward, through other early arrivals, other quiet men with careful hands, other houses that were supposed to be empty. She remembered a case in 1919, just after the war, when a train had been delayed by a fallen tree so that a certain package might change hands unseen. She remembered the way human nature rarely changed, only the scenery around it. That evening, as the light faded and the first lamps were lit in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked the short distance to the lane that led to the Grange. She did not go near the house itself. She merely stood at the bend where the high yew hedge began and looked at the gravel drive. There were fresh tyre marks. Not many, just enough to show that a motor car had come and gone since morning, quietly and without lights, if the faint scuffing near the gate was any indication. Miss Marple turned homeward, her knitting bag under her arm, her thoughts as orderly as the stitches she would later count by the fire. Somewhere inside the empty Grange, a silver-haired man was unpacking a leather case. Somewhere, perhaps, a signalman was counting the extra sovereigns that had made an early arrival possible. And somewhere in the village, behind lace curtains, behind polite smiles, someone already knew why the 9:17 had come an hour before its time. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she unlocked her own front door. Human nature, she reflected, was a timetable that never ran quite as advertised. And mysteries, like trains, were most revealing when they arrived early. Chapter 2. The Empty House. By the following morning, the early train had become the chief topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead, ranking only slightly below the question of whether the new curate's sermons were too modern. Miss Marple, however, had already moved beyond the timetable. She rose at her usual hour, watered the Michaelmas daisies, and then walked the half-mile to the railway halt with a small basket of late apples for Mr. Hodge. The station-master received them with gratitude and a faintly harassed expression. "Never known the like, Miss Marple," he said, polishing his watch for the third time. Signal box up at Meadley Junction reported a temporary failure just after 8. Cleared itself, they said. Train came through early and that was that. Head office is asking questions, of course. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested on him with mild interest. "And the gentleman who alighted, did he give a name?" Mr. Hodge shook his head. "Didn't speak to me. Just walked off toward the village. Looked like quality. First-class ticket, according to the guard." She thanked him and continued on her way, pausing only to notice that the platform clock still stood 5 minutes fast. An old idiosyncrasy no one had ever troubled to correct. Clocks, she reflected, were rather like people. They could be made to tell whatever time suited the occasion. At 10:30, she presented herself at the Bantry's door. Dolly was already in the morning room, surrounded by seed catalogues and a half-finished tapestry of a hunting scene. "Jane, you look purposeful," Dolly said at once. "Have you discovered something dreadful?" "Not yet," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair opposite, "but I should very much like to see the Grange. From the outside, of course. One does not simply walk into empty houses without reason." Colonel Bantry, who had entered in search of his pipe, gave a short laugh. "Empty or not, the place gives me the shivers. Old Fortescue died in that upstairs bedroom, you know. Heart, they said. Though the solicitor's still sorting the will. No relatives close enough to care, apparently." Miss Marple murmured something non-committal. She had known Arthur Fortescue slightly, an elderly, solitary man who had returned from India with more money than conversation. His death the previous spring had caused little stir beyond the usual village speculation. 20 minutes later, the three of them stood at the iron gates of the Grange. The drive curved between dark yews, and the house itself, grey stone, many-windowed and slightly forbidding, looked exactly as it had for the past 3 years, shuttered, silent, and faintly resentful of visitors. Yet the tyre marks Miss Marple had noticed the evening before remained clear in the damp gravel. A motor car had come and gone. More than once, she thought, studying the overlapping tracks. Colonel Bantry rattled the gates. They were locked, as expected. "We'd need the solicitor's permission to go further," he said. "Chap in London, Mr. Penrose of Penrose and Blythe." Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her gaze had travelled upward to the first-floor windows. Most of the shutters were closed, but one, on the west side, overlooking the old orchard, stood slightly ajar. A pale rectangle of daylight showed against the darker wood. "How odd," she said softly. "One would think the caretaker would keep everything secure." "There is no caretaker," Dolly put in. "Not since March. The solicitor said it wasn't worth the expense until the estate was settled." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested against her arm like a small, patient animal. "Then someone has been inside recently. Shutters do not open themselves." They stood in silence for a moment. A blackbird scolded from the yew hedge. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and fell quiet. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the second set of footprints. Not the heavy tread of a delivery man or a curious villager, but smaller, neater impressions that led from the side gate, half hidden by ivy, toward the orchard wall. A woman's shoes, she thought, or a man of slight build who preferred not to use the main entrance. Colonel Bantry saw them too. "Well, I'm hanged, trespassers." "Or visitors who preferred not to be seen," Miss Marple corrected gently. They did not linger. The Colonel insisted on driving them back, declaring that empty houses and early trains were best left to the police if anything further developed. Miss Marple agreed politely and said nothing of the small object she had noticed half buried in the gravel near the side gate, a silver button, the sort that might come from a man's glove or the cuff of a well-cut overcoat. She had not touched it. Evidence, she knew, was best left where it lay, until one understood its meaning. That afternoon she called upon the vicar's wife. Griselda Clement was young, cheerful, and possessed of an admirable ability to recall the smallest details of parish life. "The Grange," Griselda said, setting out teacups. "Oh yes, there was a man asking about it only last week. Tall, grey hair, very polite. Wanted to know if the house was still closed. I told him what everyone knows, waiting on the lawyers. He thanked me and went away. I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the handle of her cup. "Did he give a name?" "No, but he had a slight limp in the left leg. I noticed because he leaned a little on his stick when he turned to go." A limp. The silver-haired passenger from the early train had walked with perfect evenness. Two men, then? Or one man who sometimes found it useful to appear less able than he was? Miss Marple walked home slowly as the October light began to fade. The village street was quiet. Only the postmistress's cat sat washing itself on the step of the post office. Ordinary life continued, as it always did, while somewhere behind the yew hedges of the Grange, a different sort of life, or the absence of it, waited to be understood. That evening, by the fire, she took out her knitting. The soft click of the needles filled the small parlour. She was not, she told herself, investigating. She was merely observing. And observation, in a village the size of St. Mary Mead, had a way of leading one into the most unexpected corridors of human behaviour. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the apple tree. Inside, Miss Marple counted her stitches and thought of trains that arrived early, shutters that opened themselves, and silver buttons that should not have been lying in the gravel of an empty drive. Somewhere in the quiet house on the hill, a leather case had been opened, and whatever had been inside it was already beginning to cast its long, careful shadow over the village. Chapter 3. The Silver Button. Miss Marple did not sleep particularly well that night. It was not that she was given to nervous fancies, far from it, but the image of the half-opened shutter at the Grange kept returning whenever she closed her eyes. In the morning she rose earlier than usual, fed the birds, and then sat for some time at her writing desk with a sheet of plain paper before her. She wrote nothing at first. She merely looked at the blank page and allowed her thoughts to arrange themselves as neatly as the rows of tatting she sometimes worked in the evenings. 2 men, or 1 man who found it useful to limp. An early train, fresh tyre marks, a woman's footprint, or a slight man's, and a silver button lying in the gravel as though it had been dropped in haste. At 9 o'clock, she put on her coat and walked to the post office. Young Gladys was already behind the counter, sorting the morning's letters with the brisk efficiency of someone who knew every handwriting in the village. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Anything for you today?" "Only the usual circulars, I'm afraid." Miss Marple accepted the small pile and lingered a moment. examining a stamp with mild interest. "Gladys, do you remember the gentleman who asked about the Grange last week? The one with the slight limp?" Gladys looked up, surprised. "Oh yes, miss. Tall, grey hair, very soft-spoken. He bought a book of stamps and asked whether any letters had come for the house lately. I told him no, nothing since March. He seemed disappointed somehow. Did he leave an address?" "No, miss, just thanked me and went out. I noticed he leaned on his stick when he reached the step." Miss Marple nodded, as though the information were of no great consequence, and left with her circulars. Outside, the October air was sharp and clear. She walked slowly toward the churchyard, where the old yews stood like dark sentinels around the graves of people who had once known every secret the village possessed. It was there, among the tilted headstones, that she encountered Mr. Clement, the vicar. He was examining a cracked inscription with the air of a man who had temporarily forgotten the cares of the parish. "Ah, Miss Marple, a fine morning for reflection, is it not?" "Indeed," she replied. "I was thinking of Arthur Fortescue. One sees so little of a person in life, and then suddenly they are gone, and one realizes how little one knew." The vicar sighed. "A solitary soul. He came back from India with his health already failing, rarely left the house toward the end. I visited him twice. He spoke mostly of the garden and of a nephew he had not seen in years. I believe the estate is still unresolved. The solicitors are being deliberate." Miss Marple's gloved fingers rested lightly on the top of a weathered stone. "A nephew?" "Yes. Somewhere abroad, I gathered. Australia, or perhaps South Africa. Fortescue mentioned him only once, and rather bitterly. Said the young man had disappointed him." She filed the information away with the same quiet care she used for knitting patterns. A disappointed nephew, an empty house, a man who arrived by an early train carrying a leather case. That afternoon she paid a second visit to the Bantrys. This time she brought the silver button, wrapped carefully in a clean handkerchief. She placed it on the tea table between them. Dolly leaned forward. "Where did you find this, Jane?" "Near the side gate of the Grange. It had been half trodden into the gravel. Colonel Bantry picked it up and turned it toward the light. Good quality. Military, perhaps? Or from a gentleman's overcoat? Look at the hallmark. London. Quite recent." Miss Marple said nothing. She was watching the way the button caught the sun, throwing a tiny, bright reflection across the polished wood of the table. Reflections, she thought, often showed more than the object itself. "I think," she said at last, "that someone entered the Grange the night before last, or early yesterday morning. The shutter on the west side was open. The footprints by the side gate were fresh. And this button was not there when I passed the day before." Colonel Bantry frowned. "You walked past the Grange the day before the train arrived early?" "I often do. The lane is pleasant in the afternoon light." She smiled faintly. One notices when things change. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a gardener's rake scraped against gravel. Inside, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the steady indifference of all good clocks. Presently Dolly spoke. "What do you intend to do, Jane?" Miss Marple folded the handkerchief back around the button and returned it to her bag. "Nothing dramatic. I shall simply continue to observe. Human nature, you know, has a way of revealing itself if one is patient enough, and trains that arrive early are rarely accidents." She rose to leave. At the door she paused, as though a further thought had occurred to her. "Dolly, do you recall whether old Mr. Fortescue ever employed a housekeeper after his return from India?" "Only for a short time. A Mrs. Lanscombe. She left quite suddenly about 6 months before he died. Said the house was too quiet for her nerves. Went to live with a sister in Devon, I believe." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "Too quiet," she repeated softly. "Yes. Empty houses can be very noisy in their own way." She walked home through the lengthening shadows, the silver button resting against the skein of wool in her knitting bag. The village street was almost empty. Only the baker's boy cycled past, whistling a tune that belonged to a brighter season. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered the pattern that was slowly forming. An early train, a man with a leather case, another man, or the same man, with a limp, a disappointed nephew, a housekeeper who had found the silence unbearable, and a single silver button lying where it had no business to be. She did not yet know what the leather case contained. She did not yet know why the train had been made to arrive an hour before its time, but she knew, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that the answers would not remain hidden forever. In villages such as St. Mary Mead, secrets had a limited lifespan. Sooner or later they found their way into conversation over teacups, or into the careful observations of an elderly lady who preferred knitting to speculation, until speculation became unavoidable. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the apple tree. Inside, the fire settled with a soft sigh. Miss Marple counted her stitches and waited, as she had waited many times before, for the next small, telling detail to present itself. Chapter 4. The Housekeeper's Silence. The next day brought a thin, persistent rain that turned the lanes of St. Mary Mead into ribbons of dark mud. Miss Marple spent the morning indoors, finishing a pair of soft white socks for the church bazaar and listening to the steady tap of water against the window panes. Rain, she had often observed, had a way of slowing village life, just enough for people to talk more freely than they might under a clear sky. At 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, sheltering under a large black umbrella and carrying a basket of surplus apples from her own trees. She accepted a cup of tea with the air of one who had important news to impart, and intended to do so at once. "You have heard, of course, about the motor car at the Grange last night?" Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "I had not," she said mildly. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward. "Old Mr. Abbott, who lives in the cottage beyond the orchard, saw headlights turning into the drive just after midnight. He is certain of the time because his clock had just struck. The car stayed no more than 20 minutes, then left again the way it had come. No lights on the return journey," he said. "Most peculiar." Miss Marple poured more tea. "Did he see the driver?" "Only a figure in a dark coat, too far to recognize. But he is quite sure it was not a local motor." "The engine sounded different, smoother," he said. After Mrs. Price Ridley had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time considering the information. A second visit to the Grange, this time by night and without lights. The silver-haired passenger from the early train had not, it seemed, finished his business. That afternoon the rain eased. Miss Marple put on her stoutest shoes and walked to the small row of cottages that lay beyond the church. She had decided it was time to speak with someone who might remember more about the final months of Arthur Fortescue's life. Mrs. Lanscomb's sister had, as Dolly Bantry recalled, lived in Devon, but the housekeeper herself had not vanished entirely from local knowledge. A cousin still resided in the neighbouring village of Much Benham, and it was to this cousin, Mrs. Edith Marsh, that Miss Marple now directed her steps. Mrs. Marsh was a thin, upright woman, with sharp eyes and the cautious manner of one who had learned not to gossip lightly. She received Miss Marple in a neat parlour that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. "Mrs. Lanscombe," she said, after the usual civilities. "Yes, she is my cousin. Lives with her sister near Exeter now. Quiet life. She does not care to speak of her time at the Grange." Miss Marple's expression remained politely interested. "I wonder why. The house is so very empty these days. One imagines it must have been lonely even when Mr. Fortescue was alive." Mrs. Marsh hesitated. Then, as though reaching a private decision, she set down her cup. "It was more than lonely, Miss Marple. My cousin said the house had a way of listening. She claimed she heard footsteps in the upper corridor when she knew Mr. Fortescue was downstairs. Once she found a cupboard door open that she had locked herself the night before. Small things, but they unsettled her." "Did she speak of them to Mr. Fortescue?" "She did. He told her it was the settling of an old house, and that she must not let her nerves run away with her. Shortly after that she gave notice. She said she would rather live in a smaller place with ordinary noises than in a large one that made its own." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the nephew? Did she ever mention him?" Mrs. Marsh's mouth tightened. "Only once. Mr. Fortescue received a letter from abroad. Australia, she thought. After reading it, he was silent for 2 days. When she asked if there was anything she might do, he said the young man had written to ask for money and that he had refused. He added that some blood was thinner than water, and that was the end of the matter. Miss Marple thanked her and walked home through the thinning rain. The information settled in her mind, like the final pieces of a half-finished puzzle. A nephew who had asked for money and been refused. A housekeeper disturbed by unexplained sounds. A man who arrived by an early train carrying a leather case. And now a motor car that visited the Grange after midnight without lights. That evening, she wrote a short, carefully worded letter to Messrs. Penrose and Blythe in London, the solicitors handling the Fortescue estate. She did not mention early trains or silver buttons. She merely inquired, as an old acquaintance of the late Mr. Fortescue, whether any progress had been made regarding the disposition of the property, and whether the nephew had been located. She signed it with her usual neat signature and posted it before the last collection. Later, by the fire, she took out the silver button once more and laid it on the table beside her knitting. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, yet small things, she knew, were often the ones that refused to be ignored. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The village lay quiet under a sky the colour of old pewter. Somewhere beyond the yew hedges of the Grange, a house that was supposed to be empty had received at least 2 visitors in 3 days. And somewhere, perhaps, a leather case had been opened, its contents examined, and a decision reached that could not be undone. Miss Marple picked up her needles. The soft, regular sound filled the parlour. She was not, she reminded herself, a detective. She was merely a woman who had lived long enough to recognise the patterns human nature insisted upon repeating. Still, as the fire burned lower, she found herself wondering what sound a house made when it was no longer empty, and whether the footsteps Mrs. Lanscombe had heard had ever truly belonged to the settling of old timber. Chapter 5. A Letter from London. 2 days passed before the reply from Messrs. Penrose and Blythe arrived. It came in the morning post, a crisp white envelope with a London postmark, and the firm's name printed in discreet black lettering. Miss Marple opened it at her breakfast table, buttering a slice of toast with one hand while she read. The letter was polite, brief, and carefully non-committal. Progress on the Fortescue estate, they wrote, was being made as swiftly as circumstances allowed. The late Mr. Fortescue's will was clear in most respects, but certain inquiries regarding a residual legatee, a nephew, Mr. Raymond Fortescue, last known to be residing in New South Wales, had not yet been concluded. Should Miss Marple have any personal knowledge of the gentleman's present whereabouts, the firm would be grateful to receive it. The letter closed with the usual formalities and the signature of a junior partner. Miss Marple set the page down beside her teacup and regarded it thoughtfully. A residual legatee, a nephew who had asked for money and been refused, and now, it seemed, a nephew who could not be found. She finished her breakfast slowly, then put on her coat and walked to the Bantries. The morning was cold and bright. The last of the rain had left the hedges glittering. Dolly was in the garden, cutting the remaining chrysanthemums for the house. "From the solicitors?" Dolly asked at once, seeing the envelope still in Miss Marple's hand. "What do they say?" Miss Marple summarised the contents without embellishment. Colonel Bantry, who had joined them, gave a sceptical grunt. "Nephew in Australia, eh? Convenient distance. If the man wants the estate, why hasn't he come forward?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "he has." The Colonel looked at her sharply. Dolly's secateurs paused in mid-air. Miss Marple continued in the same quiet tone. "A man arrived on an early train 3 days ago and walked directly toward the Grange. Another visitor, or the same one, came by motor car after midnight. The house is no longer as empty as the solicitors believe, and a silver button was dropped near the side gate. Small things, I know, but they accumulate." Colonel Bantry rubbed his chin. "You think this nephew has come back without announcing himself?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone with a strong interest in the house has arrived, and that the early train was not an accident of the signals." They stood among the chrysanthemums for a moment in silence. A robin hopped along the path, indifferent to human concerns. Presently Dolly spoke. What will you do now, Jane? Observe a little longer, and perhaps speak to Mr. Abbott, who saw the motor car. Old men who live alone often notice more than they realize. Mr. Abbott's cottage stood at the far edge of the orchard, its garden neat but sparse. The old man himself was seated on a wooden bench in the weak sunlight, a plaid rug across his knees and a pipe between his teeth. He recognized Miss Marple at once and offered her a chair with the formal courtesy of an earlier generation. "The motor car," he said, when she had explained her visit. "Yes." Just after midnight, headlights came up the lane, turned in at the Grange gates, and stayed a short while. When it left, the lights were out. I thought that odd. People who have nothing to hide do not drive without lights on a dark night. Could you see the driver? Only a shape. Tall, I thought. Wore a dark coat and a hat, moved quickly. He paused, tamping the tobacco in his pipe. There was something else. Just before the car arrived, I heard a sound from the orchard, like a gate being opened carefully, then footsteps on the grass. Light ones. Not the driver. Someone already there, waiting. Miss Marple's gloved hands rested quietly in her lap. A second person. I believe so. The footsteps stopped when the car came. After the car left, I heard them again, going back toward the house. She thanked him and walked home by the longer route, past the church and the row of almshouses. The information settled into place with the others. An early train, a midnight car, a waiting figure in the orchard, a nephew who could not be found, and a house that refused to remain empty. That afternoon, she sat by her window with her knitting, watching the village street. Ordinary life continued. The baker's van passed. 2 children ran by with school satchels. Mrs. Hartnell walked purposefully toward the post office, no doubt carrying another strongly worded opinion on the state of the nation. Yet beneath the ordinary surface, something had shifted. Miss Marple could feel it the way one feels a change in the weather before the first cloud appears. Toward 4 o'clock, a stranger walked down the high street. He was not the silver-haired man from the train. This man was younger, broader in the shoulder, and carried a small suitcase of a type rarely seen in St. Mary Mead. He paused outside the Blue Boar, looked up at the hanging sign, and then went inside. Miss Marple noted the detail without comment, even to herself. Strangers were not unheard of, but strangers who arrived so soon after an early train and a midnight motor car were worth remembering. As the light began to fade, she put away her knitting and drew the curtains. The silver button still lay in the small china dish on her mantelpiece, catching the last of the afternoon sun. She looked at it for a long moment. Somewhere in London, the solicitors were still searching for a nephew named Raymond Fortescue. Somewhere in the Grange, perhaps, that same nephew, or someone who found it useful to wear his name, had already made himself at home, and somewhere between the two, a leather case had been opened, its contents weighed, and a decision taken that would not remain private much longer. Miss Marple turned from the window and prepared a simple supper. Outside, the first lamps of the village were being lit. Inside, the quiet of her parlour settled around her like a familiar shawl. She was content, for the present, to wait. Human nature, she knew, disliked waiting. Sooner or later it would move again, and when it did, the next piece of the pattern would reveal itself. Chapter 6. The Man at the Blue Boar. The stranger who had entered the Blue Boar the previous afternoon did not remain a stranger for long. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, a new face at the inn was examined from every angle before the day was out. By morning the consensus was that he was a commercial traveller of some sort, quiet, well-spoken, and not inclined to linger in the public bar. Miss Marple heard the details from Gladys at the post office while collecting a small parcel of embroidery silks. "Name of Reed, so Mr. Mace at the Boar says," Gladys reported. "Paid a week in advance. Has a suitcase and a leather writing case. Asked the way to the Grange, but only in a general sort of way. Said he was interested in old houses. Didn't go up there yesterday, though. Spent most of the evening writing letters in the parlour." Miss Marple thanked her and walked on, the parcel tucked under her arm. A writing case. Another leather case. She did not believe in coincidence where leather cases were concerned. At 11:30, she made her way to the Blue Boar herself, on the perfectly respectable errand of inquiring after a recipe for quince jelly that Mrs. Mace had once promised her. The landlord's wife was in the kitchen, and while they spoke of fruit and sugar, Miss Marple's mild gaze travelled through the open doorway into the parlour beyond. The stranger, Mr. Reed, sat at the corner table near the window. He was younger than the man from the early train, perhaps 40, with dark hair already thinning at the temples, and a face that looked as though it smiled rarely. Before him lay several sheets of paper and a fountain pen. The writing case rested at his elbow, its flap closed. He glanced up as Miss Marple's shadow crossed the threshold, then returned to his work without expression. She noted the quick, protective movement of his hand toward the case, an automatic gesture, almost unconscious. Mrs. Mace, following her glance, lowered her voice. "Keeps to himself, that one. Polite enough, but not what you'd call friendly. Asked me yesterday if the big house on the hill was still empty. I told him it was. He just nodded and went back to his writing." Miss Marple accepted the quince recipe with genuine thanks and left. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke. She walked slowly toward the church, turning the new information over in her mind, as one might turn a smooth stone in the palm of the hand. 2 men, 2 leather cases, 1 early train, 1 midnight motor car, a nephew who could not be found, and now a quiet stranger who asked about the Grange and preferred to write letters rather than converse. It was possible, of course, that Mr. Reed was exactly what he appeared, a man with a professional interest in old houses. It was equally possible that he was not. That afternoon she called upon Dolly Bantry once more. They sat in the morning room while the Colonel was out shooting with a neighbour. Miss Marple described the newcomer without embellishment. Dolly listened with growing attention. "2 of them, Jane. You think they are connected?" "I think it would be strange if they were not. The Grange has stood empty for months without a single visitor. Now, within days of an early train, we have a midnight car, a man who walks directly from the station toward the house, and another who takes rooms at the inn and inquires about the same property." She paused, her eyes resting on the tapestry Dolly had been working, huntsmen and hounds frozen forever in pursuit. "There was a case," she said presently, "many years ago, in a village not unlike this one. A young man returned, after a long absence, claiming to be the heir to a modest property. He had the right papers, the right manner, even a small scar the family remembered. It was only later that someone noticed the scar was on the wrong hand. Imposture is rarely perfect. There is almost always one detail that does not fit." Dolly shivered slightly. "You think one of these men is pretending to be the nephew?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone wishes the estate to be settled in a particular way, and that the early arrival of the 917 was arranged so that the first move could be made before the village was fully awake." They spoke a little longer of ordinary things, the church roof fund, the new curate's unfortunate choice of hymns, before Miss Marple rose to leave. At the door she added one further quiet remark. "If you should happen to walk past the Grange in the next day or 2, Dolly, you might notice whether that west shutter is still ajar. Small things have a way of changing when one is not looking." The remainder of the day passed without incident. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon in her garden, cutting back the last of the summer's growth and thinking of scars that appeared on the wrong hand. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. Greed, fear, and the desire to rewrite the past wore different clothes in different decades, but the cut of them remained the same. As dusk settled, she stood for a moment at her gate and looked toward the distant rise where the Grange sheltered behind its yews. No lights showed. The house gave no sign that anyone walked its corridors or opened its cupboards in the dark. Yet she knew, with the quiet certainty that had guided her through many quieter mysteries, that the house was no longer empty. 2 men had arrived, one by train, one by some other means. Between them lay a leather case whose contents had not yet been explained, and a silver button that should never have been dropped in the gravel. Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage. The first stars were appearing above the church tower. Somewhere in the Blue Boar, a fountain pen moved across paper. Somewhere behind the locked gates of the Grange, another kind of writing, older, more permanent, was being considered, altered, or perhaps destroyed. She closed the door gently behind her and drew the curtains against the gathering night. The pattern was not yet complete, but the threads were drawing together, and soon, she knew, one of them would pull taut. Chapter 7. The West Shutter. The following morning, Dolly Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage earlier than usual, her cheeks pink from the cold and her expression unusually serious. "You asked me to notice the shutter," she said without preamble, once they were seated by the fire. "I walked the lane just after 9. The west shutter is closed now, tightly, as if someone wanted to make certain no one could see inside." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "I see. And there is more. The side gate, the one half hidden by ivy, was no longer locked. The chain was hanging loose. I did not go in, of course, but the gravel just beyond it had been freshly swept. Not by the wind, by a broom or a branch. Someone has been tidying away footprints." Miss Marple's pale eyes rested on the flames for a moment. "Tidying," she repeated softly. "Yes. People who have nothing to hide rarely trouble to sweep gravel in an empty drive." Dolly leaned forward. "Jane, do you think we ought to speak to the police? Inspector Slack is not far away at Much Benham." "Not yet." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. "We have an early train, a midnight motor car, a closed shutter, and a swept path. We do not yet have a crime that can be stated in a single sentence. Inspectors prefer sentences that end with a clear offence. For the moment, we have only a pattern." She rose and went to the small china dish on the mantelpiece where the silver button still lay. She did not pick it up, she merely looked at it, as though it might speak if given enough time. "I shall walk that way myself this afternoon," she said. "There is sometimes more to be seen when the light is beginning to fade." The afternoon proved grey and still. Miss Marple set out at 3:30, carrying her knitting bag as she always did on such walks. She took the longer route, past the almshouses and the old mill stream, so that she approached the Grange from the orchard side rather than the main lane. The side gate stood open, exactly as Dolly had described. The gravel beyond had been smoothed with care. No footprints remained. Miss Marple did not enter. She stood for a while beneath the bare branches of an apple tree and looked up at the house. Every shutter on the visible side was closed. The west window, which had shown a pale rectangle of daylight only days before, now presented a blank face of dark wood. Yet something about the house felt different, less abandoned, more watchful. She could not have explained the impression to Colonel Bantry, or even to Dolly. It was the sort of feeling one acquired after years of noticing when a room had been recently occupied, or when a cupboard door had been opened and closed again with care. As she turned to leave, a figure emerged from the deeper shadow of the yew hedge near the main gates. It was the silver-haired man from the early train. He walked with the same measured step she remembered, the leather case still in his left hand. He did not see her at first. When he did, he paused only long enough to incline his head with distant courtesy, then continued toward the lane without increasing his pace. Miss Marple watched him go. The limp she had heard described was not present. His stride was even, controlled, and entirely without haste. Either the limping man was someone else, or the limp had been a temporary convenience. She did not follow. Instead, she walked back toward the village by the main road, her mind turning over the new arrangement of details. The shutter closed, the path swept, the silver-haired man still carrying his case, still moving as though the house belonged to him. At the Blue Boar she paused. Through the parlour window she could see Mr. Reed at his usual table. The writing case was open now. He was reading a letter, his expression intent. When he finished, he folded the page carefully and placed it inside the case, then locked it with a small key he kept on a thin chain. Miss Marple continued on her way. 2 leather cases, 2 men, 1 house that was being quietly prepared for occupation, or for something else. That evening she sat by her fire and considered the shape of the problem. In her experience, people who went to the trouble of arriving early, of moving without lights, of sweeping away footprints, were rarely engaged in ordinary business. Ordinary business did not require such careful timing. She thought again of the nephew in Australia, Raymond Fortescue, who had asked for money and been refused, and who could not now be found by the solicitors. She thought of the housekeeper who had heard footsteps in an empty corridor. She thought of the silver button lying in its dish, a small, bright object that did not belong to the gravel of an abandoned drive. Presently she took out a sheet of paper and began to write a second letter to Messrs. Penrose and Blythe. This time she was slightly more direct. She mentioned that certain signs of recent occupation had been observed at the Grange, and that two gentlemen, neither of them known to the village, had shown a marked interest in the property. She did not accuse, she merely informed. The solicitors, she knew, would prefer information to speculation. When the letter was finished and sealed, she set it on the hall table for the morning post. Then she returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. Outside, the night was clear and cold. Stars shone above the church tower with the hard brightness of early winter. Somewhere behind the yew hedges of the Grange, a house that had stood empty for months was no longer keeping its secrets as carefully as before. The shutter had been closed, the path had been swept, and the silver-haired man still carried his leather case as though its contents had not yet finished their work. Miss Marple counted her stitches and waited. The pattern was growing clearer with every quiet day. Soon, she suspected, it would demand a more active response than observation alone. Chapter 8. 2 Cases. The second letter to Messrs. Penrose and Blythe, left with the morning post. Miss Marple watched the postman take it from the box at the end of her garden and continued on her way toward the shops with the settled feeling that certain wheels, once set in motion, preferred to turn without further assistance. The village was quiet that morning. A thin mist hung over the water meadows, and the smoke from cottage chimneys rose straight into a pale sky. At the butcher's, conversation still circled around the early train and the stranger at the Blue Boar, though both subjects were beginning to lose their first freshness. Miss Marple purchased a small joint for the weekend, exchanged a few pleasant remarks about the weather, and walked home again. It was not until early afternoon that anything further occurred. She was sitting by the window with her knitting when she saw Mr. Reed leave the Blue Boar and turn up the lane that led toward the Grange. He walked at a steady pace, the writing case under his arm, and did not look back. 10 minutes later, the silver-haired man appeared from the opposite direction, coming down from the house itself, and the two met at the bend where the yew hedge began. Miss Marple's needles slowed. They did not shake hands. They stood a little apart, speaking in tones too low to carry. The silver-haired man held his leather case in both hands, as though it required the protection of his full attention. Mr. Reed listened with his head slightly tilted, then made a short gesture toward the writing case he carried. For a moment it seemed the older man might refuse whatever was being offered. Then he gave a single, reluctant nod. They moved together into the deeper shadow of the hedge and were lost from sight. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. The meeting had lasted less than 3 minutes, yet it had altered the shape of the problem. The two men were not strangers to each other. Whatever business had brought them to St. Mary Mead was shared, or contested. She did not follow. Instead, she put on her coat and walked the other way, toward the churchyard, where the old stones stood in their familiar silence. It was there, among the graves of people who had once known every quiet transaction of village life, that she allowed her thoughts to arrange themselves. 2 leather cases, one man who arrived by an early train, one who took rooms at the inn and wrote letters, a house that had been entered, tidied, and shuttered, a nephew who could not be found, and now a meeting conducted in the shadow of a yew hedge, with neither party quite at ease. She remembered a similar arrangement of facts from many years earlier, a disputed will in a neighbouring parish, 2 men who claimed the same identity, and a single document that had been altered with great care and almost perfect success. Almost. The flaw had been a date written in the wrong ink. Small things, again. Always the small things. When she returned to her cottage, the light was already beginning to fade. She lit the lamp in the parlour and drew the curtains halfway, leaving enough of a gap to watch the lane if she wished. The silver button remained in its dish on the mantelpiece. She looked at it once, then deliberately turned her attention to the sock she was turning at the heel. Toward 5 o'clock, Dolly Bantry arrived, slightly out of breath and carrying a basket of late pears. "I've just come from the lane," she said. "The two of them were there, your silver-haired man and the one from the Blue Boar. They went in through the side gate together. The gate is closed again now, and I am almost certain I saw a light move behind one of the ground-floor shutters. Only for a second, but it was there." Miss Marple accepted a pear and set it on the table. "A light," she said. "Yes, that would follow. Jane, this is becoming serious. Empty houses do not develop lights of their own." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "They do not." She was silent for a moment, considering. Then she said, "I think the time has come to speak to Colonel Bantry about the police. Not because we have a complete story, but because the house is no longer empty and the solicitors in London still believe that it is. They ought to be informed that their property is receiving visitors." Dolly looked relieved. "Arthur will know how to put it. He can telephone Inspector Slack this evening." After she had gone, Miss Marple remained by the window a little longer. The lane stayed empty. No further light showed from the direction of the Grange. Yet the knowledge that two men were inside the house, two men with leather cases and unfinished business, settled over the quiet parlour like a change in the air pressure before a storm. She prepared a simple supper, ate it without hurry, and then returned to her chair. The fire settled with a soft collapse of ash. Outside, the first frost of the season was beginning to form on the grass. Inside, Miss Marple counted her stitches and thought of documents, of nephews who could not be found, and of the particular silence that falls over a house when its new occupants are deciding what must be done next. Somewhere behind the closed shutters of the Grange, 2 leather cases had been set down upon a table. Somewhere, a conversation was taking place that could not be allowed to reach the village street. And somewhere, in the careful mind of an elderly lady who preferred observation to haste, the final threads of the pattern were drawing into place. She did not yet know the whole of it, but she knew enough to be certain that the early train had been only the beginning, and that the end, when it came, would arrive with the same quiet inevitability as a signal returning to green. Chapter 9. The Inspector's Visit. Colonel Bantry telephoned Much Benham that same evening. Inspector Slack, who preferred clear-cut cases to village uncertainties, listened with audible impatience and agreed to drive over the following morning. "Empty house, odd visitors, early train," he repeated, as though tasting each phrase for substance. "I'll have a look, Colonel. But if it's only a pair of trespassers, I'll not be best pleased." Miss Marple heard the arrangement from Dolly at 8:30 the next day. She received the news with a quiet nod and continued buttering her toast. "You will come with us, of course," Dolly said. "Arthur insists. He says you notice things the rest of us walk past." Miss Marple smiled her usual vague smile. "I shall be ready." Inspector Slack arrived at the Bantry's door punctually at 10. He was a square, energetic man, with a habit of looking at people as though they had already wasted his time. He listened to Colonel Bantry's summary, glanced once at Miss Marple, and then suggested they drive at once to the Grange. The side gate stood closed but unlocked. The gravel remained unnaturally smooth. Slack examined the lock, the hinges, and the swept path with the air of a man who expected little and found exactly that. When they reached the front door, he knocked hard, waited and knocked again. No one answered. "Empty, as reported," he said. "I'll try the back." They walked around the house. Every shutter was fastened. The kitchen door was locked. No smoke rose from any chimney. The place gave the appearance of having been empty for months, yet the air near the scullery window carried a faint, recent scent of tobacco. Miss Marple noticed it and said nothing. Slack produced a key obtained that morning from the local agent of Penrose and Blythe and opened the front door. The hall smelled of dust and old wood. Their footsteps echoed on the uncarpeted floor. The inspector moved from room to room with brisk efficiency, opening shutters as he went, letting the weak October light flood in. In the drawing room, the furniture stood under dust sheets. In the study, the desk drawers were empty. Upstairs, the bedrooms were undisturbed except for one. the large chamber that had once belonged to Arthur Fortescue. There the dust sheet on the bed had been turned back, and a single glass stood on the bedside table, dry but recently used. Slack examined it without touching. Someone's been sleeping here, or sitting at least. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her knitting bag over her arm, and looked at the glass. Then her gaze travelled to the hearth. A small quantity of fine grey ash lay among the cold coals. Paper ash, she thought, not wood. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Anything missing, Inspector?" "Not that I can tell without an inventory. The solicitors will have to say. For now it's trespass and possible damage. I'll have a constable keep an eye on the place." They were preparing to leave when Miss Marple spoke for the first time since entering the house. "Inspector, the west bedroom shutter was opened 4 days ago and closed the next. The path was swept. 2 men entered together yesterday afternoon. One of them still carries a leather case he has not been separated from since he left the early train. The other keeps a writing case locked with a key on a chain. Neither man has given a satisfactory account of himself in the village." Slack looked at her with the expression he reserved for elderly ladies who offered theories. "I've noted the points, Miss Marple. If either of them returns, I'll have questions. Until then—" He stopped. From somewhere above them came a soft, distinct sound, the closing of a door that had been open. All 3 stood still. Slack moved first, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Colonel Bantry followed. Miss Marple came last, her steps quiet and unhurried. The upper corridor was empty. Every door stood open as they had left it, except the door to a small dressing room at the far end. It was closed now. Slack opened it carefully. The room contained only a wardrobe, a washstand, and a narrow window that looked onto the orchard. The wardrobe door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the hanging rail was empty except for a single dark overcoat. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the coat for a moment. Then she said, almost to herself, "The silver button." Slack turned. "What button?" She did not answer at once. She was looking at the sleeve of the overcoat, where a small thread of darker silk showed that a button had been torn away. "I found a silver button in the gravel near the side gate on the morning after the early train," she said. "It is still in a dish on my mantelpiece. I believe it belongs to this coat." Slack examined the sleeve, then the floor of the wardrobe. Nothing further presented itself. He closed the door with a sharp click. "I'll take the coat," he said, "and I'll speak to both those men today, the one at the Blue Boar first." They left the Grange under a sky that had begun to lower. As they drove back toward the village, Miss Marple sat quietly in the rear seat, her gloved hands folded over her bag. The house was no longer merely empty. It had been occupied, used, and, when visitors arrived, hastily vacated. Someone had been inside while they searched. Someone who moved with enough care to close a single door and leave no other trace. At the Blue Boar, Inspector Slack went in alone. When he emerged 10 minutes later, his expression was tighter than before. "Reed left first thing this morning," he said, paid his bill and asked for a taxi to the station. "The silver-haired gentleman has not been seen since yesterday afternoon. I've sent word to the junction and to Paddington. If either of them tries to board a train, we'll hear of it." Colonel Bantry looked at Miss Marple. "Well, Jane, still only a pattern?" Miss Marple's gaze was distant, fixed on some point beyond the village street. "The pattern is clearer," she said, "but the final piece has not yet dropped into place. When it does, I think we shall find that the early train was not the beginning of the story, only the moment when the story could no longer remain hidden." She said nothing more. Yet as she walked the short distance to her own cottage, she carried with her the image of the empty wardrobe, the missing button, and the fine grey ash in the bedroom grate. Paper had been burned. A coat had been abandoned. 2 men had left the house by different routes and at different hours. And somewhere, still moving carefully between them, was the reason the 9:17 from Paddington had been made to arrive an hour before its time. Chapter 10. The Burned Paper. Inspector Slack's inquiries at the junction produced one solid fact before noon. Mr. Reed had boarded the 10:42 to London, travelling 3rd class, with a single suitcase and the writing case still under his arm. The silver-haired man had not been seen at any station along the line. Slack issued a description to Paddington and to the local constables, then returned to the Grange with a second key and a more determined expression. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly at home. She cleaned the silver button with a soft cloth, laid it once more in its china dish, and then sat by the window with her knitting, waiting for the small, inevitable movements of village life to bring her further news. It arrived at 12:30 in the form of Dolly Bantry, who came in without ceremony and set a folded newspaper on the table. "Arthur has been on the telephone again," she said. "The solicitors in London have replied to your second letter. They are sending a representative down on the afternoon train. And they have confirmed something else. Raymond Fortescue, the nephew, died in New South Wales 18 months ago. Pneumonia. There is a death certificate. The residual legatee clause now passes to a more distant cousin in Canada, who has already been informed and has no interest in the property." Miss Marple's needles rested. "Died 18 months ago," she repeated. "Before Arthur Fortescue himself." "Yes, so neither of the men who came to the house can be the nephew. The solicitors are quite clear on that point." Miss Marple looked at the silver button. Then both men knew the house was effectively without an heir who would claim it. Or one of them did, and the other was brought in for a particular purpose. Dolly sat down. "What purpose, Jane?" "Documents," Miss Marple said simply. "A will that might still be altered, or a will that had already been altered and needed to be destroyed. Paper was burned in the bedroom grate. Fine ash, not the sort left by a chance scrap. Someone was removing evidence." She rose and went to her writing desk, returning with the first letter from Penrose and Blythe. She laid it beside the newspaper. The residual legatee could not be found because he was already dead. Yet someone arrived on an early train carrying a leather case, walked straight to the house, and began to use it as though he had the right. Another man followed, with a writing case and a key on a chain. They met. They entered together. Then they left by different routes when the police came near. The early train was arranged so that the first man could reach the house before the village was awake and before any watchful eye might note his interest. Dolly's voice was quiet. "You think one of them intended to forge a claim?" "I think one of them intended to make certain no genuine claim could ever be made, or to create a false one that would hold long enough for the property to be sold or emptied. The burned paper suggests the second possibility was abandoned in favour of the first." They sat in silence for a time. Outside, a cart passed slowly along the street, the horse's hooves muffled by the damp road. Inside, the clock on the mantelpiece marked the quarter hour with its usual soft precision. At 2 o'clock, Colonel Bantry arrived with Inspector Slack. The inspector's manner had lost some of its earlier impatience. He stood on the hearthrug with his hands behind his back and addressed Miss Marple directly. "The coat we took from the wardrobe," he said. "The remaining buttons match the one you found. London make, recent. We've also had a report from the signal box at Meadley Junction. The signalman on duty the morning the 9:17 ran early has been suspended. He accepted a sum of money from a man who matches the silver-haired gentleman's description, paid the day before to report a temporary failure and let the train through ahead of schedule. He claims he thought it was a practical joke. We've taken a statement." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And the ash in the grate? Fragments of heavy paper, legal paper, the laboratory thinks. Too far gone for reconstruction. Whatever was burned, someone wanted it gone completely." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "The solicitor's man arrives at 4. He'll go over the house with us. Until then, Slack has a constable at the gates." After they had gone, Miss Marple remained by the fire. The pieces had almost all fallen into place, yet one still refused to settle. 2 men, 1 early train, 1 burned document, a dead nephew, an abandoned overcoat, and a house that had been entered, used, and hastily left. She thought of the way the silver-haired man had held his leather case, always with both hands, always close. She thought of Mr. Reed locking his writing case with the small key on its chain. She thought of the light footsteps Mr. Abbott had heard in the orchard before the midnight car arrived. Presently she put on her coat and walked the short distance to the churchyard. Among the old stones, she found the familiar quiet that sometimes allowed a final detail to rise to the surface. It came to her as she stood before a weathered marker whose inscription had been nearly erased by rain and time. The limp. The man who had asked about the Grange the week before the early train had walked with a limp. The silver-haired passenger had not. Mr. Reed, from what she had observed, walked evenly. Yet someone had waited in the orchard on the night of the motor car. Someone with light footsteps. 3 people then, or 2, one of whom found it useful to appear differently at different times. Miss Marple turned homeward as the afternoon light began to thin. The solicitor's representative would arrive soon. The house would be examined again. The signalman's statement would be weighed. And somewhere, still free, still carrying whatever the leather case had originally contained, one of the men who had used the Grange for his own purpose continued to move carefully through the ordinary world. She reached her own gate as the first drops of a new rain began to fall. Inside, the parlour was warm and familiar. She set the silver button once more in its place, sat down with her knitting, and waited for the final thread to pull taut. The early train had brought the beginning. The burned paper had marked the turning. What remained was the quiet, inevitable arrival of the end. Chapter 11. The Final Stitch. The representative from Messrs. Penrose and Blythe arrived on the 3:50 and was driven straight to the Grange. He was a precise, middle-aged man named Mr. Harcourt, with the careful manner of one accustomed to dealing in other people's property rather than his own. Inspector Slack met him at the gates. Colonel Bantry and Miss Marple were already there. They walked through the house once more. In the bedroom the grate had been carefully swept by the constable, but the memory of the fine ash remained. Mr. Harcourt examined the empty drawers, the turned-back dust sheet, and the wardrobe where the overcoat had hung. He listened to the inspector's account without interruption. When it was finished, he turned to Miss Marple. "I understand, madam, that you have followed these events from the beginning." Miss Marple's reply was mild. "I have noticed certain things. The early train, the leather case that never left the gentleman's hand, the shutter that opened and later closed, the button in the gravel, the swept path, the meeting under the yew hedge, the light footsteps in the orchard, and the paper that was burned when discovery became likely." Mr. Harcourt waited. She continued, her voice as even as the clicking of her knitting needles on quieter afternoons. "The residual legatee, Raymond Fortescue, died 18 months ago in Australia. The fact was not widely known. Someone learned of it and saw an opportunity. An empty house, an unresolved estate, and a dead man who could no longer contradict any document produced in his name. The silver-haired gentleman arranged for the 9:17 to run early so that he might reach the Grange before the village was awake. He brought with him a set of papers, forged, I believe, intended either to establish a false claim or to destroy any genuine record that might complicate a quiet sale of the contents. Inspector Slack shifted his weight. And the second man. Mr. Reed was not an accomplice in the ordinary sense. He was a private inquiry agent, employed by the Canadian Cousins solicitors, once they received word that inquiries were being made about the property. He came to watch. He took rooms at the Blue Boar, asked careful questions and waited. The light footsteps Mr. Abbott heard in the orchard belonged to him. He was already there when the midnight motor car arrived. Later the 2 men met. Words were exchanged. The forged papers were no longer safe. They were burned in the bedroom grate. When the police came near, both men left, Reed openly by taxi and train, the other more carefully, abandoning the overcoat that had already lost its button. Mr. Harcourt looked at the inspector. "Does this match what you have learned?" Slack gave a short nod. "Reed was detained at Paddington this morning. He has made a statement. He was hired to observe only. When he realized the other man was preparing forged documents, he confronted him. The silver-haired man, whose real name appears to be Walter Graves, with a prior conviction for fraud in 1924, escaped the house while we were searching it. He was taken off a slow train at Reading an hour ago. The leather case contained the remains of the forgeries he had not yet burned, together with a set of blank legal forms and a seal. The signalman has confirmed the payment for the early passage. Colonel Bantry let out a long breath. So it was never about the nephew returning. It was about making certain no one could prove he was gone. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. Precisely. Greed does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, an hour early, carrying a leather case and a plausible story. The limp the village noticed the week before was merely a small piece of disguise, enough to make the first inquiries less memorable. Human nature, you see, is rarely original. It repeats the same patterns with only the scenery changed. They stood for a moment in the silent hall. The house felt different now, no longer watchful, merely empty once more. Mr. Harcourt locked the front door himself. Inspector Slack gave instructions to the constable. Colonel Bantry offered to drive Miss Marple home. She declined with a gentle smile. "I should prefer to walk. The air is clear this afternoon." She took the lane that led past the orchard and the churchyard. The yew hedges stood dark and ordinary under the October sky. No light showed behind any shutter. No footprint marked the gravel. The early train had come and gone, its purpose spent. The silver button rested once more in the china dish on her mantelpiece. No longer a mystery, but merely a small, bright object that had told the truth when larger things tried to hide it. At her own gate, she paused and looked back toward the rise where the Grange sheltered among its trees. In a few weeks, the solicitors would settle the estate. The distant cousin in Canada would sell the place, or keep it, or let it fall further into silence. The village would return to its usual concerns, the church roof, the new curate's sermons, the price of coal. And the story of the train that arrived an hour early would settle into local memory as one more curious incident, half forgotten by spring. Miss Marple opened her door and stepped inside. The parlour was quiet and familiar. She set her knitting bag on the usual chair, drew the curtains against the fading light, and sat down by the fire. For a while she did nothing at all. Then she took up the unfinished sock and began again where she had left off. Outside, the first lamps of St. Mary Mead were being lit. Inside, an elderly lady counted her stitches and reflected, not for the first time, that the most interesting arrivals were rarely the ones the timetable promised.